It's wonderful to have you here. My name is Mai Musié. I am an ancient historian and the Public Engagement and Heritage Officer at Swansea University. I am also a Trustee of Classics for All, so I'm very pleased to be your host this evening. We have a fantastic event planned for you, but before we kick off, just some quick housekeeping rules. So as you can see at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box and a Q&A box. If you have any technical issues or questions, please submit them in the chat box, where a CFA staff member is on hand to help you. There'll be some time at the end for me to put your burning questions to our speaker. Please submit any questions you have about the talk in the Q&A box and not the chat box. That is where I will be selecting them from. Now, it is with a great pleasure that I introduce our speaker, Professor Greg Woolf. Many of you will know Greg as a former director of the Institute of Classical Studies in London. He recently moved to Los Angeles, lucky him, where he is now Ronald J. Mellor Professor of Ancient History at UCLA. Greg has published widely on the history and archaeology of the Roman world. He has a long-standing interest in the culture of empire in the ancient world, and much of his work considers the Roman world from a global perspective. He is currently working on a book about migration and mobility in the Roman Empire, and it is on this topic that we will hear him speak tonight. Now, I feel pretty special to be hearing this too, as my own research focuses on race and ethnicity in the ancient world, and particularly on migration under the imperial age. So I'm very excited to dive into this subject with Greg. So over to you, Greg.
Thank you, May, and welcome to everybody. Good evening, UK. Good morning from California. I've not put in front of you pictures of the palm trees outside my office. I don't want to make people feel too jealous. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is, I need my participant screen sharing to be re-enabled, please. It's disabled at the moment.
Greg, we are just sorting that out for you.
Okay, I'll just tell the warm-up jokes, don't worry.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to be talking about today is about some new work that's been done, not just mine, lots of people's work, on the Roman Empire. Is a very dynamic place, a place that we often used to think of as something that was quite quite stable, with people mostly living in their own tiny little worlds. And over the last few years, we've come to realize much more vividly how much people moved about, how much the Roman Empire is a moving story. And what I want to do in the talk, once we get going, is to, first of all, sketch out some of the kind of movement that happens, and then ask the next question on, which is who moved? Who came from where? Who traveled? How many moved? Where did they go to? What were the purposes they moved for? And alongside that, who stayed at home? So who were the movers and who were the stayers? And I'll then come on to a particular kind of movement, a movement that turned out to be terribly important for keeping the Roman world in the shape we've recognized it in. And that's the involuntary movement of people across borders. And I'm going to end with one of the most spectacular movements across the borders of all, those that happened towards the end of the 4th century of the later Roman Empire, the movements of populations from north of the Danube, south into the Roman Empire, and what this meant for Roman civilization and the survival of the Roman Empire. So now I'm going to have another go at showing my screen. Brilliant. Okay, so thanks very much, May. Thank you for that introduction. And I also want to say what a pleasure it is to speak for Classics for All, which is such a fantastic charity. And as someone who also learnt my Latin and Greek in a state school, owing to the huge dedication of teachers that are struggling to find space for it in their normal curriculum, I'm so pleased to be supporting this charity. So, to begin with then, the Roman world's a connected world. This wonderful tablet from the Torlonia collection shows the port of Ostia with a vessel coming in and coming into a port which has on it, you can see a great pharos, a lighthouse in the background, with a flame, and also enormous statues, a statue of victory. There's Poseidon with his trident. There's a triumphal arch drawn by elephants. Only Romans could get their chariots drawn by elephants, and much else. And coming in, a great boat, a sailing boat, and then to the bottom left-hand corner, some poor little figure pushing along, perhaps some guiding or collecting stuff that's fallen off the boat. So this is the centerpiece of the Roman world, Ostia, the port of Rome. Now, in recent work, and I'll just quote two writers here, there are a lot of people have begun to realize that the ancient world wasn't the static world that we might have thought it was. This is a world in which there is a dramatic movement, but this doesn't mean that everybody moved all the time. It wasn't like our world, which we got so used to the fact that we can nip from country to country, except when there's a pandemic, or easily move about our own lands. The Roman world had a lot of people moving in it, but a lot of people who stayed. And so here is Elena Isaiah, professor at Exeter, also writing about the levels of human mobility that not only were possible, but actually essential to the way in which the Roman Empire worked as a defense system, as a commercial system, as a social system as well. And two of the major books that have appeared in recent years, both of them 21st century, Just the Case of Corrupting Sea, which have reshaped our view of the Mediterranean as a connected world, a world in which local communities are constantly energized by contacts from each other. Now, here is the port of Rome itself, Portus, a great model set up some years ago here, illustrating what was then thought to be the shape of Portus, and an aerial photograph showing the unlovely site of Fiumicino Airport, but also the great hexagonal bay, which is the harbour that Trajan built to shelter vessels coming into Rome from the sea, to provide a connection between Rome and the rest of the world. Now, there's much more on Portus if you go to the University of Southampton website, and particularly it's a tribute to the work of the late and very much missed Professor Simon Kay, who really has revolutionized our understanding of how Roman ports and the Roman Empire as a whole was connected up. And here, another one of the great ports of the Roman Empire, built this time not by an emperor, but by a client king, by Herod, the port of Caesarea Maritima, now in Israel, just an hour or so north of Tel Aviv. And you can see, I hope, in the slide on the left, not just the aerial photo of the remains of the Roman city, which are very impressive to walk through, and I highly recommend it as a visit to anyone visiting Israel. It's also wrapped around it is a Crusader castle with surviving Roman aqueducts. But also look out to the west, look into the sea and see these dark stains, and you can see the traces of a huge deep water harbour constructed there. And it's constructed by a Roman client king using a brand new Roman technology. You can see what I mean on the slide on the right. The Roman technology is cement that sets underwater. So this is a cement that you can float a frame out, and you can see it being dragged out there by oarsmen out to where it needs to stand. And then into the wooden frame, you then pour cement. This is a technique developed on the Bay of Naples in the 1st century BCE. And then it sets, and then you break up the frame, move it away, move the frame over, do it again. And this is how they're able to build vast harbours to allow vessels that are much larger, but crucially much deeper draft than ever before, to connect up the Roman Empire. And we can begin to see in the early Roman Empire a network of these very, very large ports, which can shelter huge vessels carrying stone from Egypt or grain or other large, high bulk cargoes, usually on their way first to Rome and then later to Constantinople. And at these centres, there are great storage facilities. On the left, you have one of the great warehouses built at Ostia, the port of Rome. Warehouses which documents show we use not just for grain, but also textiles, pepper from the Indian Ocean, and all sorts of other goods of very high value. And beneath the Forum at Arles, you'll see this great cryptoporticus. Arles in southern France is probably the highest point that seagoing vessels would get up the Rhone. And so here in Arles, imports from Italy and the rest of the Mediterranean are unloaded, stored, and then go on to smaller vessels to go up the Rhone or onto carts to be taken through the famous Roman road network through the Gauls, heading for the German armies up on the Rhine. And this is just a quick glimpse of some of the huge amount of really high quality work that's been done on migration and mobility in recent years, and lots of familiar names, I think, probably here. Yeah, as somebody working on this like May at the moment, I feel very, very fortunate to be working in the aftermath of a whole series of amazing studies by archaeologists, by paleobotanists, by epigraphists, by historians, by geographers, from which we're beginning to piece together this new sense of a highly connected and highly mobile Roman Empire. Or was it? Well, yes, it was mobile in the sense that people moved about. You'll see on the right, it's of course not a rather mythological scene, but on the left, you can see one of the mosaics from the Piazza della Cooperazione in Ostia, two boats, two small sailing boats coming, and behind it, one of these pharos, one of these lighthouses, which of course in the ancient world consisted of a great burner on the roof. And there was one outside Alexandria, one in Ostia, guiding ships coming from the open sea as they need to find the right approach route into the harbours of the empire. Now, some moved and some stayed. Part of my work has been trying to work out the rough proportions. And so not just the numerical proportions, but out of that vast imperial population of maybe 100 million people, how many of them moved and how many stayed at home? And who were the movers and who were the stayers? There's different ways to count it, and people have looked at travellers moving by road, by rivers, and particularly by sea. And it's the travel by sea I want to focus on, because this is the cheapest way to move long distances. And this is really how people did the bulk of their journeys. Often the journeys were connected up, as Colin Adams at Manchester's made clear, sorry, at Liverpool, Colin, often their routes connected up, long sea journeys and then shorter ones by river and road, but at either end. But it's the sea journeys that we can look at in most detail and connect up. And we begin to see there's a pattern, and the pattern is lots of short hops from island to island, from port to port along the coast, which you can do almost any time in the year, so long as you keep clear of the bad weather. But then also the long distance journeys from those deep water ports I mentioned, which can really only happen in the sailing season from May to September. Because if you're caught far from a deep water port in a storm in the Mediterranean, you're in trouble. Long haul routes over the open sea, pretty rare now. We're beginning to find the deep sea wrecks through the use of remote operating vehicles. Robot underwater exploration machines like those used to film the Titanic. And they're being used by lots of teams, including the Centre for Mediterranean History at Haifa, among others. But we're beginning to get a picture of how these major routes operated. This is a smaller vessel. Most of the maritime trade for most of antiquity took place in small merchant ships like this, just 15 meters long, only 25 tons, only 4 people, because the more people you put on a merchant ship, the more space you can't use for cargo. So tiny ships, and then operating alongside this small number of super freighters carrying great granite columns or vast cargoes of imperial grain. And here's the open sea in the book I put up by Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell. Most of the Mediterranean you can travel keeping the land in sight at any time. But look at the route from Alexandria to Rome and you can see you're passing through some dangerous waters. Sometimes ships would take quite circuitous routes just in order to miss out the big points in the middle where you could get lost. How do we know how many people traveled on a vessel? We have a few accounts of shipwrecks. Josephus talks about a vessel that sank with 600 people aboard. And one of the great Alexandrian vessels was carrying Paul when it was wrecked, with 276 passengers, relating the Acts of the Apostles. But mostly the ships were fewer, and there were no great passenger vessels in the ancient world except for short hops. So most travelers traveled on the back of merchant ships, or if they're of high status, on military ones. So relatively few people could get on each vessel. And this gives us a chance to calculate, look at the number of vessels that traveled and get some sense of how many people can have moved in any one year. There's the periods of which you can't travel, of course, been known for a long time, and this is from Hesiod's Works and Days, a period of the year when you try to avoid traveling. And Hesiod, even back in the Archaic period, is advising people to steer clear of the sea during the winter seasons, the periods of high wind. Some people have been trying to calculate journey times. This is a project run up the road, as it were, from me in Stamford, and this by Walter Scheidel. And the Stamford Orbis project, which you can find and use online, and you can set your own parameters, pick 2 places and work out what time of the year you want to travel and see how long it takes. And this is just a nice quick illustration of how much larger the Roman Empire is in the winter in terms of journey time. 26 days from Rome here compared to just 5 days here. And this is calculated on the basis of itineraries and other ancient journeys. So back of the envelope calculations, how many people traveled? If we look at the various estimates, we get to maybe somewhere between 800 and 1,500 vessels traveling every year, most of them small, none of them dedicated to carrying passengers, so mostly carrying only 20 or 30 people on board at the most. And if we do the various calculations on these, we end up with the conclusion that maybe, at most, maybe 1 in 1,000 people in the Roman Empire made a long distance journey every year. So very few movers and very few stayers. When we can look at journeys, most people are moving just around their own city state or to the next one and so on. So there's a constant hum of local travel. But then there's also this small groups of people who move enormously long distances, but it's 1 in 1,000. If we look at records from inscriptions for where people are recorded as dying a long way from home, we can look at the Treveri from Northern Gaul, a great trader nation, as well as a great military nation. Virtually all those who we have traveling are soldiers, Treveran soldiers, or they're merchants. So it's not casual travel, it's not tourism. If we look at figures from other provinces, people have done them for the inscriptions from Gaul, ancient France, and from Spain. You get a sense how few people die far from home. Maybe 5% are commemorated as being buried anywhere other than in their home cities, or let alone or from cities nearby to them. And this pattern picks up wherever we can trace the migrants. So most people did live, not in small worlds, but in smallish worlds. 1 or 2 cities they may have visited. When we ask who's moving, we get an even clearer sense. Most of our travellers are men. In fact, almost all of them are men. I and various others have looked hard for women travellers. And we find a few high status people, the wives of governors. We find a few, but most people who travel, if they're women, are slaves. Some of them are travelling in the elite households. One of the most common kind of travel is an ornatrix, a hairdresser. So if a governor's wife travelled, she would take with her her maids, her hairdressers, her personal assistants. But mostly our travellers are men. Most women in the ancient world live in tiny worlds, and most men not much bigger. But the ones who really see the world, the ones who had looked at the English Channel and Syria, people like Ammianus Marcellinus, who served up on the Rhine and has campaigned against the Persians at the other end of the empire. People who've been like Hadrian, who've been to Egypt and Greece many times, and the Danube provinces, and Africa and Rome, and was born in the first place in Spain. These are men. So the cosmopolitan world of the Roman Empire is a male world. And the only other women who travelled are the women who travelled as slaves. And this is something I'm going to examine in just a moment. So a tiny fraction, those who we know most about, who travel are very high status people, Roman administrators, but there's only 50 odd governors. They don't all move every year, maybe 50 odd procurators. So these very high status Romans are making just a dozen or so journeys every year. Ambassadors from the cities, but there's only 2,000 cities and most didn't send an embassy every year. Maybe some sent an embassy only every 10 or 20 years. So the Roman Empire is connected up by the soldiers and by the traders and by the slaves. I'm moving now to migrants in chains, to the slaves, the enslaved people who make up the bulk of our travellers. And this relief is from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, but originally comes from Smyrna. That's the city of Izmir in Western Turkey. And it shows three figures here. The one on the left, from his helmet, is a soldier, perhaps a centurion, and he's clothed and he wears some body armour. And the ones on the right are nearly naked and they are chained, they're fettered at the neck. So unbelievably uncomfortable. Every time you move, you're aware of the chain, and they're on a short leash as well. And although not all slaves were chained all the times, the conditions in which they travelled were clearly horrendous. Slaves, once they become trusted individuals, those slaves who work their way up through a household become a doorkeeper, a treasurer, a scribe, take the master's children to school, even do teaching themselves. They live in slightly better conditions. Again, they're a tiny minority of the slaves. The slaves who are moved about from place to place, the slaves in the mines, the slaves who worked on the land, spent a lot of their time in chains or confined in incredibly small spaces. Who are they? Well, for a long time, people didn't really ask this question because they imagined that the Roman world was just a world of sort of identikit Romans who all looked much alike. And then one of the things that have really been discovered through archaeological science in recent years is quite what a diverse population was in the Roman Empire. This is the famous ivory bangle lady, a woman from 4th century York. The inscription on this tiny little sort of, this was originally part of a box they could see on the right, Soror Ave vivas in Deo, hail sister, may you live in God, strongly suggests that she is a Christian, as many Romans were by the 4th century. But if you look at her physiognomy, reconstructed from her skeletal material, you'll see that she's almost certainly somebody whose ancestors came from a number of different parts of the Roman world. It looks like the face shows a trace of characteristics that we now associate with North Africa, or possibly from slaves brought across the Sahara, or who have travelled and been trafficked up the Nile Valley, since there are close connections between the Roman Empire and the rest of Africa in this period. It doesn't look as if she has been subjected to the hardest of labour in her time. But she's also somebody who hasn't spent all of her life in Rome. What's called stable isotope analysis is a technique which enables us to look at different bits of a human body and look at trace elements, in this case, oxygen and strontium, and to compare them, those that we find in different bits of the human body, with those that are present in the water and food of the area in which the body is found. And if there's a mismatch, if the oxygen and strontium isotopes are not those most commonly found, as they're not in this case, in the area where the body is found, what this tells us is that when that body was being built in childhood, the early developmental stages, this person was living somewhere else, possibly somewhere else in Britain in this case, possibly somewhere in Spain. So here we have somebody who is apparently relatively high status, not doing hard work, someone who's a Christian, someone who spent part of her childhood, at least in formative years, elsewhere, possibly somewhere else in the Roman Empire, possibly just a different bit of the Roman province, a Christian ending up dying near the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Now, this woman is not an exception. The more we have been looking at stable isotope traces from skeletons of people living under the Roman Empire from around the empire, the more the mixed the population is. And the same applies too if we look at funerary inscriptions. This is a famous one from Arbea, the Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall. And at the bottom, you can see in Latin, the inscription, the DM Regina. So this is the shades of Regina. So a Roman name meaning queenie, but she's married to a man called Barates, who gives his origin as Palmyra. Palmyra is one of those Syrian cities devastated by Daesh in the recent Syrian civil war, right up there on the frontiers of the Parthian Persian Empire. She is from the tribe of the Catavaloni, and she is not only his wife, but his former slave. So he bought her, he came to Britain from Syria. Along the way, he bought a female slave, he freed her, he married her, presumably with the hope of producing legitimate children. And then she dies at the age of 30. There's no mention of children. Perhaps she died in childbirth. Perhaps she died from the many other reasons that limited life expectancy in the ancient world. And although the inscription's in Latin, and it's a fairly Roman style monument on Hadrian's Wall with a fairly Roman style iconography, in the bottom he's inscribed in Palmyrene script, Regina, former slave of Barate. Alas. Farewell, if you like. So this gives us an idea of some of the combinations and connections of people within this mobile empire, not among all of them, but among some of them, the soldiers, the traders, and the slaves. Now, the ancient slave trade is attested from as early as Greek literature. There are slaves in the Odyssey. And indeed, moving slaves in the Odyssey, since that's who one of the first people Odysseus encounters when he gets back to Ithaca, is a slave who'd been enslaved and brought there. But in the Roman period, we find huge slave installations in most of the great cities of the Roman Empire. Here is the slave market at Delos in the middle of the Aegean, which was said to maybe move tens of thousands of slaves every day. And people have calculated that even at its minimum, the Roman Empire is probably importing maybe 20,000 slaves a year into the empire. Why? Because it's illegal in theory to enslave people within the empire, though we know it happened, but also because there are tribes and peoples outside the empire who are engaged in regular relationships with traders around the Black Sea, around the North Aegean, across the Sahara, moving populations into the Roman Empire and selling them, men, women, and children. So Roman slaves are coming from trading ports here in what's now the Ukraine, across the Danube here, some probably across the Rhine, some coming into North Africa here, across caravans that move. This is the period when camel caravans begin to be used and being consumed by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is a net importer of humans. It doesn't export slaves, it imports them. And actually, of course, there are people who are born slaves within the empire, and there are slaves who are enslaved legally or quasi-legally or illegally inside the empire. The last part of the talk I want to give is about another movement of population, not of slaves, but again across the empire. And this is the great movement of a population across the Roman Empire in the end of the 4th century. These are the Goths, pictured here rather scenically, just having crossed the Danube, moved into the Roman Empire in 376. We know a lot about this episode because there's an account of it in the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who tells how the nations of the Goths, who'd lived on the borders of the Roman Empire for generations and already supplied troops occasionally for Romans throughout generations, and how they are then traumatized by new migrants, by the Huns and the Alans moving on the steppe. And that the Goths decide that what they're going to do, the only thing they can do is to seek the help of the Romans. And so near the bottom of this first slide, it describes how Alavivus sends ambassadors to the Roman emperor, who by now is an emperor living in Constantinople, Valens, asking if they may be taken into the Roman Empire and received as his subjects. Can we become Roman subjects? They promise to live quietly and to supply the Romans with troops if the Romans need them. And the emperors, how do they respond? The Romans, first of all, respond with fear about what's going on behind all this, but also with pleasure that this will provide a reinforcement to their own armies, since the Roman army is already by this period relying very strongly on barbarian or foreign troops. The fair now seemed a cause of joy rather than fear. They congratulate the emperor. An embassy had come from the farthest corners of the earth. Well, it's an exaggeration. They're coming from the other side of the river, unexpectedly offering a large body of recruits that they can pool their armies with the Roman armies. This to make even stronger to resist others, and then they will pay tribute. And this is not an unrealistic expectation. People have been moving across the frontiers into the Roman Empire voluntarily since at least the time of Augustus. And there are quite a few instances of this being attested, of Roman generals moving troops into the empire. In fact, here we have a nice inscription. On the road out to Tivoli, you can find a huge tomb from the aristocratic family of the Plautiae, and this is set up in the age of the Flavian emperors. And on it, one of those commemorated is Tiberius Plautius Aelianus, who served as the governor of one of the Danube provinces in the time of Nero. It's a long inscription. It ends with a claim that Nero didn't appreciate him, but the new emperor Vespasian really does, and gives him honors for all his achievements later in the day. So there's a bit of Flavian propaganda coming in here. But alongside the things for which he's being admired is that when Plautius was a governor on the Danube, he brought across 100,000 people who lived beyond the Danube, not just soldiers, but with them their wives and their children, entire societies, their chieftains and their kings, to come into the empire and to pay tribute, just like the Goths promised they would do a few hundred years later. And if you go through the epigraphy and the history of the Roman Empire, you will find lots of tiny mentions of troops coming across, being settled by Agrippa, by other generals, brought into the empire. So the frontier becomes an area of reinforcement, a major area of economic growth as well. And these populations are not only supplying soldiers. By the 4th century, they're even supplying courtiers and generals. And some of the most important people in the court in Constantinople can trace themselves back not very far to people who've moved into the empire. Here then is the location of the Tungri, who are a population who they can maybe see them just above the modern city of Tongres, which takes its name from them. These are Germans who crossed the Rhine in living memory. And when we think about the Roman frontier, any Roman frontier, particularly this one, we should think of it not as a kind of fence keeping people out, but as a system selectively admitting people in, resettling them, building cities, creating an intense area of Roman type societies, which will then provide soldiers to provide for further invasions into areas like the territory owned by the Chatti. And at some points, the Roman frontier actually advances slightly. So this shows the Rhine at one point, this is the frontier on the Rhine, which is going to extend onto the Neckar, swallowing up the Black Forests. And so Roman frontiers operate as ways of managing and incorporating populations into an empire that is hungry for people. It's not just the empire that's hungry, the cities are hungry too. I showed you earlier some of the images from the Stanford Orbis project run by Walter Scheidel at Stanford. One of the other work he's done is on the population of the city of Rome. And when we look at the population, we find something very odd, that there are huge seasonal deaths from August through to October every year, which is an unusual time for people to die in the ancient world. Normally you expect people to die in the winter. And the reason this happens, Scheidel argues, and there's a lot to support him, is that Rome happens to be an area that's unbelievably unhealthy. Ancient cities are probably mostly quite unhealthy, terrible sanitation, awful health advice, which I'm not going to go into right now. But essentially they were pits for disease. And they're areas, in the case of Rome, of intense malaria. Malaria is probably hyperendemic in Rome, to the point where it's very difficult to see how the population could stay that big simply by natural processes. During the Republic, the city grows because people are flooding in from conquest. But in the early empire, the city keeps big, even though other cities are growing around it. So it's not the effect of Italian Dick Whittingtons coming out of their towns up and down Italy and coming to the centre. the population of the city of Rome isn't being fed by other cities. All cities are growing or staying large in the first 2 centuries AD. And the only real likelihood is that they're growing by a massive import of slaves. Slaves come into Rome. They come into all cities, but in Rome and also in towns like Herculaneum, where a combination of biological archaeology and in epigraphy has shown quite how large the slave population was. And then many of them are freed and form part of the civic population. Some of those ex-slaves will have children who will themselves rise in the society. So all that stuff in Juvenal about slaves taking over the city, despite his negative tone, is correct. These cities really are repopulated regularly by migrants in chains. And this can only happen because the Roman Empire can import slaves from elsewhere. So the only thing that keeps the Roman Empire going is migration. The migration of slaves we are beginning to trace through every possible scientific technique available, through paleo-DNA, through stable isotope analysis, the kind I described earlier, by looking at the many languages spoken in Rome and inscribed, the many kinds of graffiti we get all over, by connecting up inscriptions from across the empire, now through digital techniques and big data, like the one, or to do studies like the ones I showed you earlier, which shows how many people ever actually die far from home, how many move and how many are the movers and how many are the stayers, and also by a better understanding of the archaeology of Roman infrastructure and the limitations on Roman transport technology. The world I've been showing you then is a world which is constantly in motion. Rome, the motion picture, is an empire that we have to imagine not like a sort of static shape, not as buildings, but more like a fountain where stuff has to constantly flow in to keep the shape of it going. And what stuff flows in? The stuff that flows in are slaves. And the slaves come from all parts, but particularly from Northern Europe and from Africa, particularly Africa below the Sahara. And so the Roman Empire keeps itself going through a constant inflow of people. Most of the people in the empire, most of the freeborn people, stay where they are. They live in cities that are sustained, maintained, and kept profitable by these influxes. If the modern world is dependent on flows of oil, the ancient world is dependent on flows of people. Thank you for your attention.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Greg. That it's just kept me riveting, as always. There's clearly still so much we can learn about the movement of people in the Roman Empire. So I can see that we have a few questions in the Q&A chat in box there. But what I'm going to do is possibly, I don't know if it is a question, but it's really I'm going to be like been out at conference, is really just the interesting sort of cultural exchanges going on in terms of the movement of people. So you've got people moving around and bringing with them their own sort of cultural heritage, their own language, their own religion, and so forth. And can you say just a little bit more perhaps about how the so-called kind of Romans, static Romans, were influenced by those coming in, and particularly elsewhere as well?
It's a really interesting question, May. They were influenced in the sense that they depended on them, but they weren't influenced the way we are. So I spent a lot of time earlier when I was working in the Roman Empire trying to find evidence of sort of cultural imports. And I thought, well, I expect if there are people from all over the empire, and if they themselves are served everywhere in the Roman Empire, they would do things like have all sorts of different kinds of art, different kinds of costume, different kind of food. So I started on food and I worked my way through Apicius's Roman cookbook. And there's about 400 recipes, almost all things to do to pig or chicken. And there's only one of them which has even any sense of being at all exotic. And this is a Moroccan chicken. So you think about great cosmopolis today, like New York or London or Los Angeles, where I am at the moment, and you think, there's no kind of food you can't eat. You can eat. Where I used to live in London, I go on the bus, I pass through the Azeri restaurants, the Georgian restaurants, the Ethiopian restaurant, the Polish restaurants, the Italian restaurants, the Greek restaurants, before I got to the end of my bus route. Rome doesn't have that. They're not very interested in foreign stuff. They're interested in foreign materials. They say this marble came from Africa, this marble comes from Greece. They're interested in foreign food stuffs. I'm the first person to serve pheasants from the Caucasus at the banquet. But they didn't want to eat Indian, they didn't want to eat African, they never ate Spanish, even people who'd served there long periods. So the stayers, they're quite committed to a kind of monocultural Greek and Roman style of living. But what they're dependent on is people who have to learn Latin to talk to the people who've enslaved them, but quietly between themselves talk hundreds and thousands of languages.
I can expand that so much more, but I'll go straight on to one of the first questions. So this is really a question of traveling for pleasure. So did the Romans go on holiday in and around the empire? And did they travel purely for pleasure and tourism? And if so, where would you say they've would be their hotspots?
We've got some inscriptions from Egypt which show Roman senators, and papyri from Egypt show that Roman senators, when they could get permission, which you needed to go to Egypt, would visit, and they would see the pyramids and the labyrinth. And Romans went to Greece. But when I say Romans, the Romans I mean are the richest of the rich. It was common to send young aristocrats to go and finish their education in the cities of the Greek East, Athens in Rhodes in particular, from the Republic onwards. They like to see what have come down to us, the seven wonders of the ancient world, but all of which are in the East. So yes, Hadrian, other senators, but most Romans not at all, no. I mean, maybe a governor in an area would do this. So we find, for example, the island of Samothrace, Samothraki, in the North Aegean. There are a lot of inscriptions at the sanctuary there of governors of Macedonia. So this looks like you're sent to govern Macedonia, which is in those days not a particularly profitable brief, no great cities, a lot of barbarians to the north. But at some point you think, well, I can take a bit of time out and go and visit that famous sanctuary and maybe climb to the top of that mountain that's mentioned in Homer, from which the gods could look out on the plain of Troy. But it's a tiny slither of the moving Romans who do that. So yes, they do. And the place they go to is the ancient, it's Delos, Delphi, Athens, Ephesus. It's sanctuaries above all else. They love going to sanctuaries, the Siwa Oasis, and the pyramids in Egypt.
So not traveling to Britain then?
Sadly not.
No, it's just not exotic enough. Right, we have another question from Susan Beadle, who asks, could you comment on how the extent of travel and who travelled varied over the course of the empire, comparing 1st century and 4th century AD, and how did it compare with the later republic during wars of Hannibal and Gallic wars? That might be a big question there, Greg.
It is a big question. Thank you, Susan. I mean, the big comparison, I think, is in movements of troops. That in civil wars, we find Caesar's legions and also local Gauls who he's recruited to support him, traveling all around the Mediterranean as he tackles Pompey and then finishes off Cato and the other Pompeians. So the civil war periods are where you see the most movement of troops, though not necessarily very fast by our standards. By the later Roman Empire, most of these troops have themselves become stayers rather than movers. And you quite often find when people record their origins, soldiers, they'll say, I was born ex castris, I was born in the camps. In other words, these army brats are becoming soldiers in the next generation. And so there's always some movements, but my guess is the turmoil of the late Republic, yeah, that is the maximum period of movement. In terms of the shipwreck evidence, it looks like there's more long distance trade in the late Republic and the early Empire. And that's probably because over the early empire, people begin to make for themselves things they used to have to buy from abroad. So the spread of the wine industry, or the spread of oil production, or the processes by which you can make good Italian style pottery first, not just in northern Italy, then in southern France, then in central France and Spain, then in northern France, then even occasionally in Britain. And so as people begin to develop local industries, international trade probably damps down a little bit. So those are the main differences I'd see.
And just coming back to the really interesting group of people who moved, the enslaved, one of the questions coming from the audience is what eventually brought the slave trade in the Roman Empire to an end, and did it really end, or did it change in any way?
It never became illegal. Slavery is just as legal in the Christian empire as in the pagan empire. There are some new regulations. Jewish people who own slaves are not supposed to try and force them to become Jews if they're Christians already. In other words, it's okay for Jewish citizens of the empire to own Christian slaves. The legal framework barely changes. And the most recent work by Kyle Harper on late antique slavery and by Alice Rio on early medieval slavery shows these slave systems, and often slave law legal systems, survived for centuries after the political systems in the West. The number decreases, but that's really because the areas in which they're needed, so huge cities and mining operations and industrial production, they diminish a bit as the Roman economy pedals back in most areas. But slavery carries on well into the Middle Ages. And my supervisor, Peter Ganji at Cambridge, spent a lot of time collecting ideas about slavery. And he found precisely one person in the ancient world who said slavery itself is not a good thing. So one Christian writer says slavery itself is not a good thing. Otherwise, it is as ubiquitous as the air we breathe.
Yes, not a lot has changed in that respect where you have modern slavery. No. Yes. Okay.
Well, that's interesting you say that, May. And I've been looking at the recent find from London from One Fetter Lane, that tablet that records the sale of a slave. And it tells us how much it was worth. And I happened to look around and found it was, in modern terms, it would be about the same as the recent case of a woman who was sold in a cafeteria in Gatwick Airport. So there are things that really haven't changed at all. And the price of a slave, roughly equivalent to a small car today, and something similar for a trained slave in antiquity.
Well, that just goes to show sometimes we are not as different from the people of the past.
Too true.
Yes. Right. Okay. Well, still staying on this rather poignant topic and in terms of the enslaved, William Lawrence asked, has it been said that with a number of slaves in Rome, particularly educated ones in the 1st century AD, the ordinary language on the streets might have been Greek, presumably many other languages too? I think you may have alluded to that earlier on.
No, I think I agree, William. And it's people have been working on the graffiti from Rome, and Latin's the most common language, Greek is the second most. But of course, most languages don't get inscribed, and slaves, as opposed to people who have been slaves but are now in better economic situation, are very underrepresented in inscriptions. So my guess is that probably, like in the sort of South African mining societies, people probably spoke a mixture of languages. One language they speak to people from where they're around, their family, if they've still got them, or from the same area. Often sort of pidgins and languages which enable them to sort of communicate for work purposes with others around them. Some will have learnt the language of the slave owners because as a route to social mobility. There's a tiny bit of evidence for this from the big pottery manufacturing sites at La Grafesonque in central France, where it looks like people are writing in a language that's a mixture of Greek and Celtic words and hasn't got much in the way of a formal grammar. And this is the kind of language that historically has popped up in mining societies and societies with very mixed workforces. And it's the origin of some modern languages like Swahili and so on, that you end up with a simple language which has keywords that you need, often technical words. So that's one tiny window of light, but I suspect this is happening all over. Yeah.
Brilliant. And staying on with William Lawrence, he gets an opportunity to ask a second supplementary question there. So is religion one area where Rome was influenced by foreign cults? So for example, Isis and Kybele, the Magna Mater, and I think we talked a little bit about that earlier.
Yes, there's some work done on slave cults, but Romans do pick up other cults too. Isis gets everywhere, but she doesn't do it very quickly. So she's a Bronze Age goddess in Egypt. By the fourth, she's around in classical Athens a little bit. There are temples of Isis on Delos in the Hellenistic period, some built by Egyptian traders, some built by Greeks who've learned about the cult of Isis. Around the same period, the Ptolemies are deliberately creating a cult of Isis that connects her up to Demeter and to other major goddesses around the Mediterranean. She makes it, presumably through trading links, to Sicily and southern Italy in the 2nd century BC. There's a temple of Isis in Pompeii. Isis worshippers are thrown out of Rome temporarily at the end of the Republic in a period of sort of xenophobia, but when Vespasian wins his civil war in 68-69 AD, he comes from Alexandria with the blessing of the goddess Isis and builds a great temple, the Iseum on the Campus Martius, which is one of the great monuments of Flavian Rome, and has recently been a huge publication of this by leading classical archaeologist from the Netherlands, Michael John Versluys. So yes, Isis does very well, but it's not instantaneous. It comes by stages, and I could tell a similar story, but with slight variations through Mithras. So in some cases, it's going through moving soldiers, Mithras, Jupiter Dolicanus from Syria. Some more likely traders, Isis. Kybele is very, very early, and she's brought by diplomats. So there's lots of routes by which these gods move around the Mediterranean.
Absolutely. And Thomas Dumont asks, did not the extraordinary Roman road system facilitate movement of people?
Yes, I mean, the roads were originally built for military purposes, which is why the main roads from Rome go from Rome out to areas like the Roman colony of Ariminium, modern Rimini, or down to southern Italy, the Via Appia. And that's true of the early imperial roads too. So the roads that are built by Agrippa in Gaul, up the Rhine to Lyon, then out to the Rhine, and eventually an extension off to the Channel ports when Britain comes into the Roman Empire. So these are military roads, probably upgrading existing paths. But once they're built, they can be used by other people. And crucially, of course, hard roads can be used by carts carrying heavy loads in a way that muddy roads and small tracks can't. I don't think that huge numbers of people, apart from soldiers, moved there. There may have been some slaves who were marched that way. There's a Cicero speech, what am I talking about? Cicero's speech talking about encountering a group of slaves who were being marched from Gaul down into Italy. So presumably this is a gang who are chained together and are marched down to be sold. But my guess is that sea travel's always the preferred route for heavy goods, including human beings. Some of those journeys will have started on land. So I think Colin Adams is right that we shouldn't distinguish too much between sea travel and land, that most journeys incorporate a bit of both. But for the long stretches, I think it's usually the sea.
And if you're thinking about sort of soldiers moving via ships too, they all often use the sea to get to places. Right.
And missionaries as well, people like St. Paul and others, that they choose to travel, even when they're going around Asia Minor, they hop around the edge of it by sea, because overland is time consuming and expensive, and bandits, etc.
I think we've got one more question. Are you happy, Greg?
Absolutely, yes.
Hold on. Right, and this one's from Sydney Miller. What is the proportion of stayers, mainly free, to movers, slaves? Okay,
so I think this really is quite difficult to calculate. The only way to do it is by looking at the maximum carrying capacity. of transport infrastructure. And of course, they might not have used it to its maximum. But I think it's quite difficult to imagine more than 50 or 60,000 people moving in any one year, long distances. And in an empire of 60 to 100, an empire of 60 to 100 million people, that's where I get my 1 in 1,000 figure. So long distance moves a tiny proportion. And if it's true that the average number of slaves who moves into the empire is 20,000, which sounds a bit on the low side to me, but this is what people say, then numerically that's still quite a small proportion. So these are, numerically it's small, but it's important all the same. And it's a small proportion that makes a huge difference. So most people stay, and by stay I mean stay in their general vicinity. You're born in Trier, you might go to Met once in your life, you might go out to Tres Tabernae on the Rhine and then back again, but broadly within the same cluster of city-states. Or you're in Athens, you might go to Thebes or Corinth once or twice, but not a huge amount. So most people spend most of their time nearish to home. And then there's this tiny proportion of people who move in and move around. And some of the journeys are back and forth, traders going backwards and forwards. And of course, they don't die away from home, we don't see them. But there's also the one-way transport. The one-way transport are recruits who go out to the legions and settle where they serve, and their slaves, who mostly never go home.
Well, that comes to the end of our fabulous event. So sadly, I think that's all we've got time for. Greg, I have to say thank you from myself for such an absolutely fascinating talk, and it's been a joy having you with us. So thank you so much for coming on to discuss your fascinating research. I can't wait to read your book.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for inviting me.
Could you say when it's coming out?
Soon. Ish.
There we are. Soon. Okay, we've all learned so much from you tonight, so thank you from all of us. Now, before we come to an end, I want to thank all of you who've come along tonight for supporting Classics for All's work through buying a ticket. Classics for All relies entirely on donations from generous individuals like yourself to fund its work supporting classics teaching in state schools. And without your generosity, we couldn't do what we do. As they say, every little helps. And if you can, I encourage you to donate to Classics for All. If you set up a direct debit with us, for only £9 per month, you could become a Centurion donor and get priority access to our events. What's not to like? I'm sure you want to go and have your dinner in a minute. I know that my barbecue is waiting for me. But before you do, I invite you to stay on for an extra 5 minutes, as we are lucky enough to have a chat with us, Erica Elsayer, the head teacher at Dalmain Primary School in Lewisham. I'm going to hand over now to our new CEO, Hilary Hodgson, and many, many congratulations, Hilary, and farewell to our lovely Jules Mann. I haven't had the opportunity to say goodbye, who will be interviewing Erica about her experience introducing classics in her school. So over to you, Hilary.
Thank you, May, and what a fascinating talk, and a very pertinent one at the moment, I think, in terms of everything that's happening in the world. As is customary, we're not going to keep you terribly long, but we do like to include in these talks a short reminder of what we're here for, which is to introduce classics in state schools. And I have to say that since we last did the video, which was a prelude to this talk, we've actually reached another 200 schools. So we're now in 1,100 schools. And the cost of introducing classics in schools is not heavy. It can be as little as £1,000 per school, and it's sustainable. And I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Erica Iserly, who is the head teacher of Dalmain Primary School in Lewisham in sunny London, kind of today. We go back a way, I think, Erica, because I remember talking to you when you were at Camelot School. I'd just like to start by asking you a question I often ask head teachers is, you must have some sort of background in classics yourself.
I'm afraid not.
No?
No background. My background is in music, and somehow ended up running a school. So definitely not in classics and stuff. I found my way to Classics for All through a contact that I play with in my piano trio. And it was just a random conversation, and that led me to researching about the impact. For us as senior leaders, it's always about the impact. And looking at the communities that you are supporting and what their needs are. And wherever you are, whether you're in London, out of London, the communities are always, there are a lot of challenges. And looking at what are those challenges and how can you best support everyone. And it was through that research that we have done classics at, well, I've worked with classics at two different schools now. What did
the research tell you? What was it that compelled you to do this, Erica?
The main things that have interested me and my leadership teams have always been about the impact for children who speak English as an additional language, about the ability to learn about the root words, the ability to transfer their learning from Classics for All and Latin to different languages, looking at the impact on the spoken, the written, the ability to read words, to decode words, pull words apart. I mean, there's so much that children benefit from learning Latin. It definitely gets eyebrows raised every so often about, what, are you really doing that as a foreign language? Yes, we are, because actually the impact is astronomical. It really is. And this is in two different schools. I've seen the impact very, very quickly, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone needed persuasion, now that you're a bit of a veteran in this, what would you say is the tangible evidence of that impact? Well, okay, it's not quantitative. This is just your observations of what it does for some of the pupils that you teach.
You see the evidence very quickly in their understanding of language, and primarily in the English language, but how they understand. English is a complicated language, and there are a lot for, bearing in mind children who will come to primary school having heard very little language, very limited language. You really have to teach them about how language is built up, those building blocks, and Latin absolutely nails that. And I have to say, Classics for All has been so both of my schools I've worked with them in have there's very, very challenging demographics there, different but very challenging in their own way. And in both places,
would you say it worked equally well with pupils of all abilities as well? Because that would be a question.
Absolutely. And writing and the ability to articulate oneself can be taught really badly in primary schools. And if you think about it, how much language is used, how much to express themselves, how much this will equip children with the ability to get a job, to write a CV. Actually, this stuff is so important, and without those building blocks, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and we know the research around the language and the type of language that is used for in certain families and backgrounds, that is even more important to teach it very, very well. And you cannot underestimate the impact that I've now seen in two schools, and very quickly. And you say that there might not be evidence. No, there is evidence, and very quickly in their written and spoken language. And I have to say, their enjoyment. I mean, would you ever expect? And I say teachers and pupils because I've had many teachers go, okay, Erica, Latin, oh my goodness. We've had the rolling of eyes, we've had the, oh, this is going to be boring. the teachers absolutely love it. The children absolutely love it. Would you ever expect, children from really tough areas in Peckham, South London, Lewisham, to run down the corridor and say, thank you for introducing Latin at our school? We absolutely love it. You hear it from parents, you hear it from governors.
Yes. I think you're right. I mean, I do hear this quite a lot, and I think that a lot of kids are absolutely fascinated with the decoding part of it.
They love it.
A huge impact on their vocabulary and the way that they then progress to learn other languages at secondary schools. I've got to go. I think we've got to go because people are getting peckish. But one last question. I'm presuming that this will stay at Dalmain, that you'll be proselytising on behalf of Classics for All.
Yes.
How easy is it, very, very briefly, to introduce this with support from Classics for All? All of your teachers presumably have got very little classics background.
Little to none, I would say. First of all, resources are fabulous. They're very easy to use. They are accessible for something that is very intimidating. As primary school teachers, we have to be experts at everything, and we're not. Actually, we need help. And resources are fabulous. They are just very, very high quality, and people absolutely love teaching them. You can't underestimate that. The training, fabulous. You start off with a session. There's a follow-up session. Again, I'll be brutally honest. Staff were, we're going to start Latin. Oh, this isn't going to be so much fun. They absolutely loved it. You know that staff are interested if they will not stop talking at the end of a session, and they didn't stop talking at the end of the first and the second session. So I would say those would be the two main things why we absolutely love working with Classics for All. The people who are part of this organisation are so skilled, so knowledgeable, very willing to work with us, be flexible. All schools are different, and like I said, I've seen it in 2 different schools, just how supportive they've been. I just wish we didn't have a pandemic in the middle, because otherwise we'd be 2 years in otherwise. But it's been great at both of those schools, and I really would say a huge thank you to everyone who's enabled us to
proselytising for us, Erica, and we are here to support you and to sustain that support. That is the point of Classics for All. We don't just dip in and dip out. You come back to us and say you've got some new teachers, we'll do it. I'm going to let people go. I'm going to thank Erica for being such a compelling and powerful advocate for the work we do, and we'll continue to support Dalmain. And I'm going to hand back to May to close off. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary, and especially to Erica for that eye-opening discussion. And as someone who didn't have classics in her school or college, I know the importance of changing minds and hearts and attitudes towards the ancient world. And so I had a fantastic university education where it opened the doors to the classical world, and look where I am today. It's amazing to hear about the successes at Dalmain, and long may it continue. And it goes to show that any state school can teach classics, and classics really is for everyone. So thank you to everyone for coming along tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I want to thank Greg Woolf once again for his absolutely fascinating and riveting and very timely talk. And I hope it won't be long before we see you again soon at another Classics for All event. So from me and from everyone, thank you and good night.